Crack on. Okay, super. Welcome everybody. It's great to have so many here. I'm Joshua Finley, and for those who are encountering SAHI for the first time, this event is organised by SAHI, that's Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment. It's made up of people who study issues of racism and migration in the UK and globally. We believe it's our duty as social scientists to use our research to inform political debates and to challenge the hostile environment for migrants and other racialized groupings produced by current UK policy. We were founded by some fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences at the time of the so-called refugee crisis at the Mediterranean in 2014. The group expanded and other concerned social scientists... Oh, hello. If everyone wants to mute just going forward, just make sure you're all muted. The group expanded and other concerned social scientists and academic and non-academic activists have joined it. In 2018, SAHI produced the report Migration, Racism and the Hostile Environment, which examined different aspects of racism and racialization in the UK towards migrants and other racialized groupings. Since COVID lockdown, it has established a series of international webinars on different aspects of these issues, as well as renewed face-to-face activities, including the conference this summer. The hostile environment itself gained notoriety as the signature policy of the Home Office under the Conservative government. The act of bordering, moving the enforcement of controls away from checks carried out at ports of entry into the daily lives of people in communities, increased the association of immigration control with issues of injustice and racism. The Windrush scandal exemplified this, but was far from being an isolated example. This evening's event is looking in particular at the transition to the Labour government. The scrapping of the Rwanda Plan suggested a willingness to tackle one part of the Conservative legacy, but this has been balanced out by a commitment to bring down net migration, by reducing reliance on migrant labour, and measures to further securitise borders and act against organised groups facilitating irregular migration. The narrative of migration as a danger to the nation also seems to be maintained under this new government. So this evening, we are fortunate to have four excellent speakers. We have Zoe Bantelman, who is a legal director at the Immigration Law Practitioners Association. She's a barrister and an editor of the Journal of Immigration and Asylum and Nationality Law. We have Nando Sigona, who is, among other roles, chair of International Migration and Forced Displacement in the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology at the University of Birmingham. And our introduction talks will be provided by Neera Yuval-Davis and Eleanor Kaufman. Eleanor Kaufman is Professor of Gender, Migration and Citizenship in the School of Law and Social Sciences at Middlesex University. And Neera Yuval-Davis is Professor Emeritus, Honorary Director of the Research Centre on Migration, Refugees and Belonging at the University of East London. Once all of our panellists have spoken, we hope there will be good time for questions afterwards for all four of them. So as we go through, feel free to put questions on the chat and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. We might try and bundle a few together and make them as concise as we can to get through as many as we can. We'll try and end very promptly at the end of our session. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Neera to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and welcome everybody for today's webinar, the first one in this academic year. In my introductory remarks, I want to emphasize that as we state in the report that Josh has mentioned, not only racism and migration are interrelated, but and need to be analyzed together, but also that the history of the hostile environment has started long before Theresa May has expressed the intentionality of creating hostile environment for migrants. Although the intensification of the hostile environment is curtailing of the possibility of more and more migrants becoming permanent part of the British society, has only grown with the years. There is quite a few of us have shown working on everyday bordering that creating hostile environments for migrants ends up in creating hostile environment for most of us as well. The other speakers are going to focus on the aspect of migration policies and, of course, on what the present Labour government is going to do about them. However, I want to focus here on two specific points. First, that the reason the last Tory government has been both the most ethnically and racially diverse government and at the same time the most racist government in British history is because its racism has been formed out of autochthonic nativist ideology. As Peter Geshe remarked, autochthony is a much emptier and elastic notion than ethnicity. It only focuses is on between those who belong and those who do not. We were here before you, and therefore you do not belong. And indeed, contemporary British hegemonic mode of racialization focuses on the differentiation of belonging and non-belonging, including in its intention to cap also legal migrants because they don't belong, although they might fulfill crucial economic and public service jobs. The second point I want to emphasize as an introductory remark is that the hostile environment and everyday bordering have been reinforcing as well as using necropolitical technologies of othering. Militarized technologies and direct involvement in armed conflicts and wars are becoming a growing feature of such state responses. But in the work of bordering, which I carried out with my colleagues Georgie Wims and Kathleen Cassidy, we found out that the result of the prevalent everyday bordering, more and more migrants join those who have become suspended before and after crossing the borders in an in-between gray zones, which makes them, instead of border crossers, an embodiment of the border itself. These people become susceptible to what I would like to call necro-racism. In Sai's report, we've been arguing that racism has two central logics, that of exclusion and that of exploitation. I used to say that the ultimate form of racist exploitation is slavery and that of exclusion is genocide. However, I recently realized that genocide is not the only ultimate logic of exclusion, although in practice, all forms of racism are often intertwined. In genocide, there is a named other collectivity, which is not only demonized, but is also conceived as an existential danger for the physical or social, economic, cultural existence of the collective us. We have most recently been hearing such narrative from some of the leaders of the current Israeli government as a justification of the war on Gaza. But there is another ultimate logic, a necrologic, in which the other has no name, no identity, no visibility, and thus no entitlement for life, let alone any other human rights. It constitutes no more than the normalized so-called collateral damage. But necro-racism is not confined to war situations. Thousands and thousands of people have drowned in the last 10 years in the Mediterranean Sea, and thousands have perished in the desert in between Mexico and the US, to name just two popular foci of mass anonymous death, which in the hegemonic discourse do not count. And with a growing reliance of AI in profiling so-called criminals and potential terrorists, the ratio of collateral damage has grown tremendously. Okay, enough for now. We can pick up some of this discussion in the discussion, and I will leave the time for the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nira. That was great. Eleanor, are you ready to speak now?
Yep.
I'll pass on to you. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. So I wanted to be a bit more policy focused, but also go back to the question that we're asking, which is it in spirit or in act that the potential changes, let's say, in the transition to a Labour government. And my conclusion is that it's very much not even in spirit, and there's going to be very little change in act in what we are about, we're going to be seeing in the next few years. Because I went back to look at some of the regulations that the previous Conservative government had brought in from December 23 in order to reduce net migration, which Neera mentioned. And it also says curb abuse. And I think this is very important also, the notion that migrants are here to both take away our culture, take away our land, take away our employment, take away and also our women in many cases. I mean, if you look at a lot of the gendered discussion that's been going on in Europe. And so this is a second pillar to the notion of the hostile environment. And I think also what's very interesting is there's a third element to what was mentioned in this review of the changes from December 23 was it was to make a net positive contribution to public finances. So again, there's this idea that migrants are to be milked, basically, that the migration industry, as far as the state is concerned, is a profit-making one. And I think we shouldn't forget that in our discussions. So it's very interesting that in this review of the changes since 23, which was published in 8th of October, so under the current Labour government, it stated quite clearly that there was no intention to review what the Conservative government had done in, let's say, mainstream migration areas. And I'm talking here about labour migration and family migration in particular. So I think that would be one of my answers to this question of in spirit or in act. And interestingly enough, I think, therefore, we really also need to look at what does the hostile environment actually comprise when we break it down. It encompasses entry regulations. It encompasses the cost of entry. And it's something, again, I think we shouldn't forget the political economy of migration here, which I think is really tremendously important. It encompasses simply the cost of being in the UK. And I'm talking here about the documented. I'm not talking necessarily about those who are undocumented, for whom it also costs a lot of money, but I'm talking about the documented in the UK, because they have no access until they have indefinite leave to remain to any kinds of public funds, which pushes a lot of them, even earning good salaries, into poverty. They have to pay the health charge, and of course pay for all of the kinds of internal checks. So I think here it's also worth looking at the components and the composites of the hostile environment when we answer this question about spirit or in act. And I think, again, as Neera has pointed out, one of the other elements of the hostile environment, which was something that Theresa May talked about quite a lot in 2012, it's to make people feel as if they're temporary. So on the one hand, you kind of charge them with being integrated and belonging to the country, but at the same time, you inculcate a sense of temporariness in them, because they're constantly having to jump through hoops to pass tests. So that you try to make as difficult as possible their ability to stay. And I think this has also been a very major aspect of the hostile environment. So that, of course, includes people threatened with deportation, but even people who are documented may fear being in some ways pushed out or deported. So I think this is also a very important aspect of the hostile environment that we need to take into account. So as I've also argued before, of course, in the last few years, we've had a so-called equalizing. So the EU migrants are being treated in exactly the same way as non-EU. And as I pointed out at the meeting that we had in London earlier in the summer, what we're seeing is a return to post-colonial migrations, because these have now become dominant. And it isn't that they're simply non-EU, they're very much, in labor terms, the old colonies, such as in South Asia, and in particular, in quite a substantial growth in African migrations. So I think these are all kind of elements that I think we should be considering in terms of where have we gone with the hostile environment. So my conclusion simply is, before I pass on to Zoe, is that it's more of the same. I'm not even convinced it's going to be very much softened. So that's what would be my conclusion from looking at some of the recent policy developments compared to what we've seen in the past few years. And if we look at the whole trajectory of the hostile environment, okay, Neera is arguing goes before 2012, that's for sure. But if we take it in its current version, then nevertheless, what we see is that I suggest that we're talking about a continuation and very, very little modification in its future versions. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Elena. Really appreciate those remarks. Just remind everybody that the chat is there, so any questions that arise, either from something Neera and Elena have said, or from Zoe and Nando going forward, do put your questions in there and we'll come to them after Nando has spoken. But yeah, just passing on to you, Zoe, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Josh. So today I just want to give a little overview of two important questions, and hopefully in our discussion we can then all reflect on the tactics that we can continue to employ to oppose the hostile environment. But first, just an overview of what the first 100 days of the new government has brought, really expanding and agreeing with a lot of what Eleanor has just said. And second, and I think more crucially, thinking what the next 100 days should and will bring. So first, the recap. What have we seen in the first 100 days across immigration and asylum? Well, first, we've heard the new Home Secretary say that this government is clear that net migration must come down, but we still have no ideal figure put forward of what net migration should be, only this abstract dream of the migrant never arriving in the UK. We see the continuation of many policies announced last December by the Home Secretary's predecessor, James Cleverly. So barring dependent partners and children of many students and health and care workers, keeping the general salary threshold increased by 48% to £38,700 per annum, regardless of where the skilled worker is in the country, regardless of their sector of work, and regardless of the shortage of the occupation. We've seen in the interim, the Migration Advisory Committee, MAC, is now commissioned to undertake a review, and while there's pending litigation brought by Reunite Families regarding the minimum income requirement for British citizens and settled persons to bring over their spouses. But in the interim, the new government has decided to keep it at the prior government's threshold of £29,000 per annum, despite the fact that it was really already tearing families apart when it was £18,600 per annum. In good news, of course, we've seen that the new government will keep the graduate visa on the recommendation of MAC, and which the higher education sector had said was fundamental given the state of university finances. The second thing we've seen is discussion of a more joined-up approach to the labour market, with just, talk of linking immigration with skills policy and reducing the need for British employers to recruit people on work visas. And MAC has also been commissioned to do a review of a few skills shortages, but there still appears to me to be no welcome, no understanding of the wealth of positive contributions that migration brings to this country, no discussion in that regard at all. Additionally, in her first 100 days, the new Home Secretary announced a crackdown on employers hiring migrants without the right to work, and for a week in mid-August, Immigration and Enforcement visited hundreds of premises and issued hundreds of civil penalty notices for thousands upon thousands of pounds. And while it was said that that operation was to tackle exploitation of vulnerable people, actually 85 people who were found without the right to work were put into immigration detention. I think this fundamentally shows that we still need a reorientation by this government. It's not only those who are doing the exploiting, but also those who are exploited, who come in the line of fire with such crackdowns. There's still no bridging visa. There's no significant reform of the sponsorship system on the books, including in the Employment Rights Bill, to ensure that people are protected from exploitation. The third thing that we've seen in the first 100 days is the replacement of the 3-word phrase, stop the boats, which we all saw what that brought this summer with the divisive rhetoric spurring racist, Islamophobic, xenophobic violence across the country. Instead, replaced now with a new 3-word phrase, smash the gangs. And despite the fact that one of the first acts of the new government was to declare that the plan to send people to Rwanda was dead and buried, and while there was some initial change in rhetoric, moving away from the language of illegal and towards irregular, there still have been many, many slippages back into illegal, and we're all guilty of this language, this shorthand of legal and illegal. Even Neera in her opening remarks also referred to legal migrants, and lawyers are some of the most guilty when it comes to referring to legal and illegal in this way. The Prime Minister has also recently expressed his interest in learning about Italy's scheme to process refugees in Albania. And so, as I've said before, we'll just have to see whether he learns the right lessons. We've seen that the UK wants a security and defence agreement with the EU, and France and Germany have already written to the European Commission asking it to negotiate an asylum deal with the UK. Meanwhile, the European Commission earlier this year in April made very clear what it wanted from the UK, an entitlement to 4 years of a youth mobility without quota for those aged 18 to 30. Any deal with the EU would also likely require the UK to act in solidarity and resettle refugees in the EU, or at least pay for those that it refuses to resettle, because the EU Migration and Asylum Pact is a package deal. And it's crucial still to bear in mind, and I think for us to continue to remind the new government, that the UK isn't receiving a disproportionate share of refugees. In 2023, there were around 13 asylum applications for every 10,000 people living in the UK. In the EU 27, there were 25 asylum applications for every 10,000 people. And so, similar to the immigration enforcement crackdowns, while there's this ramp up in securitization rhetoric and enforcement and intelligent work with plenty of recruitment going on in that space with the National Crime Agency, this new Border Security Command, the new G7 Anti-Smuggling Action Plan, the plans thus far are truly bereft of their necessary counterpart, the removal of penalization of the victims of crimes. We still, despite Keir Starmer being ex-DPP, don't have a victim-orientated approach in immigration and asylum, and we don't even have the introduction of safe routes or a commitment to settlement, resettlement that we could rely on, or even concrete plans, for example, for accepting asylum claims from Calais that would reduce the need for channel crossings. While we have some people who were evacuated on the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme 3 years ago, now finally given family reunion, I think it's also important for us to remember that was promised last October by the previous government. And so this government was just carrying through on a previous government's promise. And we still don't see pathway 3 of the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which was meant to be for women, girls, and minorities, opened more than 3 years since it was announced. So instead of safe routes, and I think this really shows how the new government is continuing in some ways the spirit of the previous administration, we've seen the continuation of breaching of the 21-day convention in Parliament. And so recently, for example, a visa regime was imposed on Jordanian nationals at 3 p.m. on the same day that the statement of changes to the immigration rules was laid in Parliament. And that really follows the pattern that we saw displayed by the previous administration, who did the same to nationals of Dominica, Honduras, Namibia, Timor-Leste, and Vanuatu. And finally, in these last 100 days, we've seen a renewed focus on asylum decision-making to deal with the backlog that was created by the Illegal Migration Act, as well as new asylum claims also being processed concurrently. And we've seen closing of RAF Scampton and the non-renewal of the Bibi Stockholm contract next January. But as far as I can see, and as Eleanor was saying, it's all very focused on the economic side of things, about value for money. There's no real focus on safeguarding the well-being of people who are coming within the Home Office's responsibility. So to further exemplify this, Haslar and Campsfield immigration removal centres are due to be reopened and the detention estate expanded, despite the fact that His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons recently found the worst conditions that he had seen in immigration detention in a recent inspection of Harmondsworth. And the Brook House inquiry recommendations still remain unimplemented. Now to come on to what the next 100 days will bring, and I don't think it will be all cheery. The King's speech this past July, we all know, made reference to a new bill, as if we needed another bill after 3 bills in 3 years, but we have the new Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill, and they've just thrown in all of the words, so it's very difficult to know exactly what the bill will contain. But it was said to modernize the asylum and immigration system by establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organized immigration crime, which was to be introduced at the earliest opportunity. So it's plausible that it may well be in the next 100 days. As the new Border Security Command is already established now in the first 100 days, based on what was teased, we can expect then these new counter-terrorism powers, deterrence and penalties for organized crime, and this is crucial in my opinion, fast-track returns for individuals coming from so-called safe countries. Before I really get into the nitty-gritty of that last point, I think that a general comment is in order because I do spend a lot of my life in meetings with the Home Office, as lovely as I'm sure that sounds to all of you. And initial discussions with the Home Office about the bill do show something positive. They do show that there is greater, I think, scope for transparency and engagement and consultation with the new government, which does create a site of possibility for those of us who do want to influence and do want to see a change. And so that's welcome under new ministers. But what I haven't seen is a real proper change in the tide. For example, pre-legislative scrutiny is something that hasn't really been discussed or offered, and it's something that we've been missing for so long in immigration and asylum. And we also, of course, need proper time and space for legislative scrutiny and a return, for example, to the House of Commons undertaking public bill committee line-by-line scrutiny of legislation and a move away from skeletal bills with unwieldy delegated powers. In the last week, I've heard the Attorney General speak several times now about the rule of law, and in particular sort of endorsing Lord Bingham's conception of the rule of law, which includes protection of fundamental human rights and compliance with our international legal obligations. So that may be, again, another positive that we can use to try to hold the government to account. But to distance itself from breaches of the rule of law, including the international rule of law, the new government really needs to repeal so much legislation. And I'm concerned that a rush move to introduce new legislation might result in a failure to conduct a thorough review of all of the draconian legislation that does need to be repealed. And that's potentially where those of us working in this field can work together to try to identify all the relevant bits and put forward a proposal. For example, the Safety of Rwanda Act is likely to be repealed, and it's of no use with the policy dead and buried. But with the Illegal Migration Act, we don't have that concrete confirmation that they wish to repeal it, despite the fact that most of it is useless without having a third country to send people to. There are some parts of it that are still in force, particularly in relation to expanded detention powers that a new government does need to be urged to repeal. And obviously, at its very heart, it made the first cut against the Human Rights Act. And so a commitment to the international rule of law and a renewed commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights, which we've heard about, should mean that the government shows some willingness to repeal it. I think the Nationality and Borders Act is another area where we really do need to concentrate our scrutiny. it's already proven to be unworkable, this Group 1, Group 2 refugee system that it introduces, but it put statutory inadmissibility on the books, and that created more problems and backlogs for the government than it solved. It also introduced a new complex and high standard of proof, which is getting in the way of streamlined asylum decision-making, which might be a reason for us to convince the government that that should be repealed. And its interpretation of the Refugee Convention was at odds with pre-existing common law. So these are all good reasons, but fundamentally, I'm quite concerned about the use of that act precisely because it does contain those fast-track return and removal powers. For example, it contains something called priority removal notices, and that created the ability for the government to put someone in an expedited appeal or accelerated detained appeal process. And so that could be used by the new government in a way which would be extremely damaging and continue the previous government's sacrificing of fairness on the altar of efficiency. And it wasn't just the previous government who used fast-track returns. We all know that it was also previous Labour governments who used fast-track returns. So by focusing on these fast-track returns to safe countries, my concern is that the new government risks repeating the errors of consecutive prior governments in the unlawful detained fast-track scheme and in the unworkable expedited new appeals and accelerated detained appeals, which are contained in the Nationality and Borders Act. Rather than speed and quantity, I think it falls on us to convince the new government that quality and getting it right and lawful the first time should really be the hallmark of their new government. And just in my last few seconds, I want to say that I also think now is the time for us to make the argument for a functioning and sustainable immigration and asylum legal aid system, and to show that that is essential to fairness. Now is the moment when the Lord Chancellor is deciding and considering how to ensure effective access to rights, to courts, to justice. She's undertaking her review of civil legal aid, and also the recent Duncan Lewis challenge in relation to immigration asylum appeal rates has meant that she's now going to consider whether to increase those rates, which were set in 1996 and have been cut more than a decade ago. So now's the moment for us to convince, I think, the new government that legal aid upholds a functioning and fair justice system, and thereby the rule of law. And without it, there simply won't be streamlined claims or appeals or even fairer removals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for that really thorough analysis. I'm sure we all really appreciated that very much. I would introduce Sigona now, but I can't actually see him anymore. Has he temporarily left the chat?
No, I can see him. He's waving. He's here.
Nando, I mean, not Sigona, sorry, Nando. Professor Sigona. Are you here to speak, Nando?
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Super, there we are. Okay, great.
Yeah, and it's great to be the last one. It could be very short, but I'm taking you on a slightly different journey in a sense. What I want to do is to try to think about a question, because it's something that I've been thinking over the years around, obviously, the continuities in terms of the logic that regulates migration governance. You know, there was the hostile environment before the hostile environment. I mean, Don has been writing about the new labor immigration policies and the exclusionary policy, how they were introduced over time. There are clearly continuities, and to some extent, we could say that there is no very high level of expectation on what's coming, and we have seen already in many ways. But the kind of work I've been trying to do in the last few years is to understand the logic underpinning. So why is this the case? Who and what are immigration policies for? Okay. So a lot of, and taking also as a kind of a starting point, also all the discussion around the spectacle of immigration enforcement, the idea that almost the migrants, connecting to what Nira said earlier, are kind of a collateral damage in the politics of migration. A lot of what happened here is not about the rights of the migrants or their well-being. It's not about that. I mean, clearly, a lot of the policy are put in place in response to public perception, the pressure of the media, conversation that actually occur in different places. This is probably, from me, is the only way something like the Rwanda Plan has any sense at all. I mean, the Rwanda Plan or the Baby Stockholm have dominated the conversation on migration for 2 years. And if you look from a logical point of view, there is no, they don't make any sense. But still, we were talking about it. They were both from the left and from the right. They were basically, the conversation was going that direction. So the point I want to make is, what can we learn from okay. What I would like to make is about what we can learn from the politics of migration post-Brexit, and in particular the way that the migration system emerged from the implementation of Brexit, and what we can expect now for the years to come. So I'm sharing a very brief presentation which include mostly graphs, and just a second. Sorry, let's go up. Okay. So, okay, so the idea is to think about the politics of migration after Global Britain, in brief. And this is based on two articles I recently published with Michaela Benson as part of the Migzen project. One, it looks at the idea of rebordering and the intersection of biopolitical, geopolitical in the politics of migration. And more recently, we wrote something for Political Quarterly, try to understand and reframe the humanitarian routes and the safe and legal humanitarian routes, particularly the Hong Kong scheme and the different Ukrainian schemes. So I'll use them as an inspiration at some point. So the first point I want to highlight is that, and what is remarkable, is the speed at which migration has changed following Brexit, which is remarkable. So the point we try to make in our work with Michele is very much that the direction and the transformation that have occurred in the profile of migration and the migration governance cannot be disconnected to the new politics and geopolitics emerging after Brexit. If you look at, and we look at the project of Global Britain as, in a sense, almost the guiding principle that shapes the direction of migration policy. So just to give you an example, if you look at the data from 2016, the referendum, until end of December 2023, so about 11 months ago, what you notice immediately is the disappearance of European EU nationals from a profile of those coming to Britain. It's really interesting how, particularly since 2021, you will see that basically we went from a situation at the time of Brexit in which the EU national made over 50% of the stock of new international migrants, in that case actually European citizens, to something which is less than 10% now. So this is a very rapid change, directly connected, not necessarily to the fact of change of policy, but you can argue that, but also a change of more general the direction of the country, how is it positioning itself in the world. The other element which is also important is also, again, to stress the point about what is migration policy about. We spend a huge amount of time talking about the irregular crossings in the English Channel. We have paid a lot of attention of the asylum routes and the humanitarian protection. One remarkable thing is that in reality, the humanitarian protection scheme, while they have actually led to a significant increase of arrival in the last few years, that actually was a very specific period of time. It's the introduction of the Hong Kong scheme and the introduction of the support for the Ukrainians. After that, those routes have, again, very much reduced significantly in terms of new arrival. But what actually makes the profile of the new migrants is essentially the working visas and the international students. As was pointed out initially, we were going to discuss the issues of education, international students in the next webinar. But what I want to actually again here stress is that what's remarkable we have seen in the last few years is a very radical transformation on the profile of the international students. The point is not, and here is interesting, that with Global Britain, you not only have a change in the overall numbers, you can see a very significant increase in the number of international students coming to Britain. And the last data we have, I think, is for the academic year 2021-22 for beginning of programs. But it's also how, again, very much the disappearance of the European students that no longer come to study in the UK. In fact, if you look at the data, you will see that overall for the international student come from two countries alone. This is China and India. I think that together they got about under 50,000 students each, or under 50,000 and 100,000. And the first European state is France with 3,000 students. Okay, that's just giving the scale of the significance of that presence in UK. But the other things that also has changed is not just who is coming, but I think it's very important also to is the condition under which they're coming. And that's Joy was very clearly also referring to the continuity in this first 100 days of the Labour government in terms, for example, not changing the regulation around sponsorship. That very much creates migrant workers which are docile, they're extremely dependent on their employers, they struggle to move between jobs, and often what we see is also that sort of sense of precariousness is very much inbuilt even in the so-called legal migration routes. But also what we see is a third element of this transformation is also the redirection of the enforcement machine. Okay, when we see what is interesting, despite the talk around the tough talk on migration, the Rwanda Plan, where everyone was concentrated on, actually the data tell us very clearly that both enforced return and voluntary return went down dramatically up to 2020, so after the referendum when they were still talking about this issue. And when we see that enforced return is still remained relatively low until 2023. Okay, what you see is after the pandemic, you have refused entry increasing, etc., and voluntary return. But again, what is interesting here is that the reorientation is not just in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of who we actually become the subject of the enforcement, with the presence of European nationals going from just about 10% in 2013 to around 40% of those who were enforced to return in 2023. Okay, so what you see is that with Brexit, Europeans become much more visible to the gaze of the state, but also they become very much a scoring point issue. They become a way of showing and constructing the fact that Britain, under the Conservative Party, as a Brexiting Britain, is no longer part of the European Union. Therefore, the EU nationals become deported and removed. And what is interesting is there is only another paper to make about this. It's in the media, we always discuss the cases of Western Europeans being subject to immigration enforcement, but the reality is that most of the people are from Romania, essentially, that are particularly, they are subject to deportation, or from the Baltic states, which raise an issue about privilege and visibility into immigration statistics. So this is what I wanted to show in terms of the general direction. But the other issue, which is interesting in terms of thinking about the future, is that a significant shift in the approach that we have seen implemented since 2020 was the co-option of the narrative of safe and legal routes that very much was championed by migrant rights campaigners that become very much part of the vocabulary of the Conservative Party, which actually said they actually had introduced safe and legal routes at the time in which they were really curtailing the right of asylum for those arriving in the country. Interestingly enough, while they said they got several safe and legal routes, in reality, if you look at the number, the 85 to 90% of those who benefit are only from two countries, Ukrainians and Hong Kongers. The Afghani and the Syrians, the scheme are there, but the numbers are relatively small in terms of who is coming, etc. So what we're seeing is there's also a transformation and redirection, a sense so that by gaining control of the borders, we also can choose who we want to protect or not. So what is happening next? What we are seeing, as very much was pointed out before, the direction of this shift. What I'm thinking about is that what we're seeing in the signals, besides what the statements at the moment, is that while as part of this politics of migration in the previous government with Global Britain, migration was very much used as to mark a shift, a reorientation of the country towards the Commonwealth. This is why we choose Rwanda, not another country, for doing the scheme, or towards building the visa, giving visa to former colonies as part of the Commonwealth. Actually, as Elena pointed out, we have a significant increase, in particular, of visa from Nigerians, particularly in the NHS, but also from India, the largest significant increase lately. And we also see, in a sense, this immigration enforcement reoriented against the EU nationals. What we have seen in the last few days is interesting because The measure that Zoe was pointed out and that end up in the media were particularly affecting these deportation flights for Nigerians national, for example, interestingly, and also for citizens of India. So what was interesting is that when the government decided to make the spectacle of enforcement again, decided to direct our attention on specific groups, not on Europeans as the previous government was doing, but more interesting, it was pointing out about other groups that benefit recently. More dramatically, I think what we are seeing is that while migration was used as a way of marking this shift, this new Brexit freedom we had gained as a part of the referendum in 2016 with the Conservative government, now we are saying the weaponization of migration to achieve exactly the opposite result in the initial movement that the government is taking. The reapproachment they're talking about from day one is very much made on deals that they will plan to sign around migration. We've seen the story about the government offering the Rwanda spaces to Germany. We have seen the trip of Starmer to Italy to celebrate the great initiative that the Italian government has made with Albania. Interestingly, Italy managed to send 16 people to Albania, and then they've already been challenged in court, and the people are coming back, and they cost a fortune. So what is interesting here is it seems like that the migrants are again collateral damage, but they are going to be used for a new geopolitics that is emerging, which see the country reapproaching Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nando. Really appreciate all of those reflections. Thanks to all four of you. We still have empty space on the chat. So do stick your questions in there, or if you'd like to put your hand up, would encourage that any questions that are spoken are very brief. But if you do have any questions, you either want to type into the chat or share with the group. There's plenty of opportunity to do so now. Everyone's been very good and on time, which is excellent. I've been citing Nira and Nando's work for years, so saying Nando still feels very casual, hence Sigona et al. Is usually is the thing that sort of jumps to mind. Yeah, does anybody have any questions for any of the speakers or all of them collectively? Well, while people think, I'll jump in with an early question. There's been lots of discussion in what everyone has shared about what looks to be the case going forward, and what looks to be in many ways a lot of continuation. Is there any sense in which a country that has voted for a Labour Party might have different expectations than a country that has voted for a Conservative Party in terms of what they can demand from a Labour government? And do you think that that has any potential influence on any resistance activities or any ways in which we seek to push back on the hostile environment under what is even at least nominally supposed to be a more left-wing government? Obviously, practically not, but in terms of the historic associations for the UK public, does that distinction provide any opportunities, do you think, in terms of resistance in any form? To anyone who would like to answer on that. Yeah, Nando.
You're muted, Nando.
You're still muted, Nando.
Sorry, just connected to what Zoe was saying around the opportunity to work around the issues of legal aid and ensuring fairness and access to justice. I think what is interesting is that if you look at the manifesto and the initial statement from the Labour Party are very much again on the border security, and there is the national security issues. In the manifesto, the labor migration only appears within relation to these issues of the apprenticeship and the trainingship, but is not in relation to migration when it discusses about illegal migrants in inverted comma. So I think there may be opportunities in terms of the mobilizing in areas which are not in portfolios which are not the one directly related to the security agenda, So there may be a way of reframing the debate and spaces to engage with ministry that are not directly engaged in this sort of let's stop the crossing, for example. So that's maybe a space for an opportunity, a narrative opportunity as well for mobilizing.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, Nira, you have your hand up.
Yes, I think this issue about Starmer going to Italy to an extreme right prime minister in order to consult with her about taking the undesirable and not belonging migrants into the another country, Albania in this case, and all the what Nando was just telling about what happened in about Albania is very interesting. But as in the chat, Sasha has commented that the whole inspiration for Albania came from the issue of Rwanda. But of course, the whole Rwanda was also inspiration of what happened in Australia and the offshoring, looking for space in which is not under the jurisdiction or the commitment for international law. I mean, the difference between Second World War, in which Anna Arendt talked about the refugees and so on, and now is that there is international law which is supposed to be protective, but more resources and more effort are spent by the government to overcome these restrictions than actually to supply them. But that a Labour prime minister went to a fascist prime minister in order to ask advice about migration, I think says it all. Whatever the practicalities of what Roy and we're talking about are, I think symbolically, the minute he went to Italy, I think any kind of hope of an alternative approach to inclusion and rethinking and creating safe ways of people to come and join and be protected. I think it, at least for me, but I think for many others, it's completely gone.
Thank you. Zoe said she'd like to come in as well.
Thanks, Josh. Really good question, I think. I'll just name a couple of ways that I think there might be some space for action and some possibility. I think one, like Nando said, is around legal aid. I think we can make the case that there's nothing that's more labor than fair pay. And that means that legal aid representatives need to have fair pay, which they don't at the moment. I think the second one, which is perhaps a task for all of us, but is to really convince the unions, convince the public, convince the government that worker solidarity must include solidarity with migrant workers, particularly those in informal and precarious positions, and that they have to overcome any internalized racism and xenophobia to extend that solidarity. I think the third thing that we can all do, and those of us who are doing research in this area, it might behoove us to try to keep a record, is when we are going through and seeing what Labour has opposed in the last 13 years, to keep good note of that, to have it ready to throw in their faces should they try to repeat what the predecessor governments have done in that interim period of time. And to also have a good historical recollection of things that prior Labour governments might also have done, which have failed and which they've recounted from since. And finally, I think the European Union does provide an interesting area for developments, because the Labour government has pinned everything to a deal with the EU, that it's now the time for the European Union to assert its desires. And like I said, the youth mobility scheme is one of them, and that may be the very wedge to reopening mobility, if not sort of more free movement between the continent and the UK. And that might also help us tackle forms of xenophobia if we were able to successfully have a mobility scheme with Europe.
Thank you so much. And Eleanor, you've got your hand up as well.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit more sanguine, because when you think about the way in which something which is supposed to be a good, like trying to stop exploitation of workers, which is one of the reasons there they're using to almost reduce immigration. So they're coupling something which is we should be working for, coupling that with simply a reduction in immigration. So I think that we need to think about the way in which they'll couple one area with another. We shouldn't forget, I mean, say to Zoe, yes, if the youth mobility scheme may be good, but we shouldn't forget that Europe is pursuing this idea of hubs, which means it's not just Italy that is thinking about Albania. The Danes already have had links with Kosovo, and that hubs is becoming a European policy. So, you know, Europe isn't necessarily the answer to a progressive migration policy.
Thank you very much for all of those reflections. The floor is still open, so any questions anybody has, if they'd like to come in now, you're very welcome. In the interim time, were there any reflections that any of the four of you had that came to mind during each other's talks? Be fine to hear as well.
Daniel Beck has asked to speak. I can see his hand.
Yeah, if you'd like to come in.
Yes, I've been coming to these webinars of social scientists against the hostile environment for quite a while, and I'm wondering if you can get a coordinated influence on the government somehow by forming a think tank or something like that, which we can all back up. You've got eminent academics here, and a lot of people who can make their voices heard in certain ways, but perhaps collectively you might have more impact. Just an idea. Think about it.
Yeah, does anyone have any immediate reflections on that? A non-billionaire funded think tank sounds like a nice nice idea. Does anyone have? Yeah, Nando, great.
No, I mean, what linked to this is interesting. One difference with the previous government is that there is much more emphasis on the MAC. They again, you know, when the Labour was very much about evidence-based policy, again, they're trying to put a lot of responsibility on MAC on decisions that they won't take themselves, as they increasingly use the subcontracting for decisions that are difficult for other part of the social policy dimension. So I think there is a space for research more than in the previous government, which we can work on. But we also know that evidence-based policy is very easy to manipulate, and academics sometimes are very sort of persuadable. You know, for having an impact, they're not necessarily stick to their plan. Yeah, let's leave it like this for now.
Yeah, Eleanor, if you want to come in.
Yeah, it was just to follow on precisely from Nando, because one of the examples I want to give, but Zoe's also involved in it, is what's fascinating is that the government has given MAC to look at this minimum income requirement. And I think that is an area where there's a possibility of movement. But unfortunately, I think one of the arguments one is going to have to make is that here we are talking about British citizens and those who are resident here for a long time. And that's in a way a wedge to reduce the pressure on increasing the minimum income. But I agree with Nando entirely. I think the fact is we've gone back to using them, and some of their decisions in recent times have been fairly progressive. So one can but hope.
Thank you. Don, is your hand up on this very point or a different question?
There was also Sasha.
Yeah, Sasha has been, yeah.
It was about whether we're moving on to a different question. That's what I wanted to check. Yeah, Sasha, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just I haven't quite thought through what I was going to say, but basically I was at the Labour Party conference, and I don't know how much news got out from what was going on there, but actually, because I saw someone in the chat asking where do we look for progressive policies, and the interesting thing is firstly, I'm with the Labour campaign for free movement. Some of our activists actually put forward progressive immigration policies, a progressive immigration policy this year to conference. And not only that, but we put it forward in previous years and had it passed. This year, for procedural reasons, it got ruled out of order. But a very reactionary immigration policy was put forward, mostly saying a lot of the same things as the Labour's manifesto. But in particular, it kind of focused on reopening asylum centres. It focused on detention centres. It focused on passing new safe third country acts in order to do third country sort of processing. So it's essentially like a new version of the Safety of Rwanda Act, picking presumably a less controversial country. I think the interesting thing is that in a lot of ways that we generated a lot of publicity about that around the conference. We handed out leaflets and things to people, and in the end, it was withdrawn. So the thing that I find quite depressing is that clearly, in terms of Labour Party members and supporters, there's quite a massive difference between where they're at and where the Labour government's at. And I'd also probably wager that that's true of Labour voters. So I think the question is how exactly we can sort of help link up the various different aspects of the sort of campaign for progressive immigration policies. Immediately stuff about like safe routes. I mean, I think the thing that's not said often enough in the public discourse is that when you have immigration controls of any type, when you have any kind of, you build any kind of wall against migration, that's inevitably saying the people on the other side of this wall aren't our problem. If they drown in the Channel, if they die freezing in a tent in Calais, whatever, that's not our problem. But but it's not said enough that that's what any border security means, and having no alternative to that means that you can't really smash the gangs, you can't really stop migration, illegal migration. Even if that's a desirable outcome, that's not possible without creating an alternative, without allowing people to just come on planes and trains like anyone else. Anyway, I'm going to finish there.
Well, does anyone from our speakers have any reflections or responses on that? Neera?
Yes, I want to, those of you who have not been at the SAHE conference in the summer, this kind of frustration that was expressed here by Danielle and others was also expressed there in the conference. And we were not thinking in terms of think tank, and of course we don't have a penny. We are not part of the formal education system, but people have expressed the wish that beyond the academic webinar, we will try and take it a bit furthermore. And this is kind of the first webinar that I'm sure Josh and Angela might want to say more about it, but want to try and push it a little bit beyond what we did before, even just in terms of writing up the contributions, and maybe people from the audience who would like also to write up a kind of interest, a concerned kind of responses or contribution on this issue. And we will try and look for various outlets, of course, in the website of SAHE, but also others which have wider readership in order to try and make some kind of an impact. I think think tanks are very much part of the mainstreaming of issues and have their own kind of dynamic, their own foci, and which I think we are trying to break and to look beyond. But any kind of ideas now in which you can think about how, in practical terms, with a penniless organization, but a lot of energy but no, everybody is very busy, but also have a lot of motivation and wish to bring things forward. I think that's very important, and anybody who want to join our membership in order to help to do that would be most welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, Don, would you like to come in?
Yes, thanks. If I can get through it without having a coughing fit. I was also at the Labour Party conference this year, and the thing that struck me, I mean, I think Sasha is broadly right in what he said, but what struck me about it was the absence of any sort of conversation about immigration policy, which, given that this was, part of the plank of the election campaign, was really significant. I recall other Labour Party conferences in other years in which the fringe, at the level of fringe meetings, there've been gatherings of a couple of hundred people or so who have tried to get to grips with the issues and the challenges in front of Labour. This time round, it seemed the sense was one of fatalism, basically, that the immigration policy that was being enacted was the one that had been written by the previous Conservative government, and it was a question of softening the edges at various points in order to offer some justification to Labour supporters that things weren't quite as bad. And that, seems to be inherently unstable, because it's not going to convince those people who voted Labour because they're expecting to see progressive change here. They're going to be disappointed by it, but also because it leaves Labour exposed to what it always has been. And I think this is part of the limitations of the evidence-based approach to challenging policy, which is that evidence is always deeply contested. Anybody who remembers what happened to the Blair government from 1997 to 2008 or so, which proclaimed itself as being, sorry,
Carry on.
Yeah, it proclaimed itself as aiming for evidence-based. Sorry, I'm getting quite a bit of feedback now from my own voice. Evidence-based was that it facilitated challenges at the level of Migration Watch and the tabloid papers, which generated their own sets of facts, which challenged, or their own sets of evidence, which challenged Labour every single point. And in the absence of a movement which extended deeper into the population, into the trade unions and other sections of the community, then Labour was always on the back foot, and it ultimately contributed to its defeat. So my conclusion from all of this is that if we're looking for leverage in order to be able to challenge what's going to be happening next, I mean, I think it really has to be rooted in what I do think has got the future for a progressive opposition to the Labour government, and that's the social justice agenda. The sense that the issues that are going to be debated time and time again is the growth of inequality, poverty, child poverty, the treatment of everybody from pensioners through to families, to working families, and so on. The significance of exploitation rising through the agenda, which Labour has tried to appropriate in a stupid and clumsy way, but it's there. And a challenge for us, it seems to be, and the work of all the think tanks that we hope might cluster around this, is how do we establish immigration as a social justice issue? How do we, demonstrate that it relates to racism, inequality, deprivation, disadvantage, and so on and so forth? And none of these issues will be properly addressed until we get our immigration policy straight again. And I think being able to contribute to social scientists and others getting on board and being able to demonstrate the interrelationship between immigration policy and these other social justice issues could be a real contribution to building an oppositional movement that we're going to be needing in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Don. Do any of our speakers have any responses they want to give to that?
Can I say a couple of things, Josh?
Yeah, sorry.
I entirely agree with lots of what Don said, and Don so kindly came to our event as well at Labour Party conference speaking on immigration policy. But I agree, it was absent from much of Labour Party conference. It simply wasn't a key issue. And I hope that part of the reason for that is that because it's not all ironed out, because really it wasn't a first 100 days issue. And I, to be honest, would recommend the exercise of caution before rushing into a policy or into legislation that will be difficult to undo. So I see no issue in terms of the new government taking its time. I just hope that in taking its time, it's using that time well. And I think that's the issue with all of us in the room, that we can't see that yet. Because fine, MAC has been commissioned to review this, that, and the other. But MAC's focus has always been far more so on the economic and policy side of things. And while I agree with you, Don, in relation to social justice, I think so much is missing from MAC's purview. It's not looking at arts or culture or the colonial history or the true full and holistic contribution that migrants make to this country. And so even turning to MAC for evidence-based review is insufficient. And I think the problem is as well that I don't see the new government going out and trying to hear from people who are affected. We hear of them being detained, we hear of them being put on charter flights, but we don't hear of them going out and actually listening and learning from people with lived experience. And all of us, everything that we're saying here, everything that we would tell the Labour government, we've probably told and has been said 100 times before. What they truly need to do is to listen to the people who are affected, to realise what needs to be changed. And that level of consultation isn't happening. And I think that's truly problematic.
Thank you very much. Zoe also responded to Daniel Beck, for those who aren't following the chat, in terms of membership of the Immigration Law Practitioners Association. I've had several discussions on the chat, but unless I've missed any, none that are specifically questions. Would anyone like to come in at this point?
Can I just say something, Josh?
Yes, Angela.
Yeah, no, just to say, I'm going to drop my email now here, the chat box, because this is something, as Nira mentioned, the idea of the new webinar series that we're starting again now is to have a specific topic, and then the contributors, they will write a kind of blog size of text, and the idea is to connect to more actions, right? So then if you are interested to connect with us, or if you want to write about a specific topic, like I saw Patricia mentioned modern slavery and trafficking. So if you want to collaborate as well, so you can send me an email, and then you're going to be in touch with us, and then we can organize something. And also the trade unions idea that Zoe mentioned here, which is very interesting as well. So if anyone would like to collaborate with us in actually trying to take some actions and move forward the debate and conversation here, please get in touch.
Absolutely. And while we're on that point, the next webinar is going to be on the theme of higher education and is scheduled for the 25th of November. So if you want to make a note of that and join us for that one as well, you're very, very welcome. Nando, did you have your hand up? Oh, sorry. I thought I had. No pressure. We have time for maybe one more question if anybody does want to come in before we wrap up at about 25 past. Peter's clarifying, Peter Burgess is clarifying to me that the emphasis on the next seminar is secondary education rather than higher education. There might be a blurring, I'm not sure, but apparently that's the focus.
I believe Nando needs to go in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so just in case anyone has a question for him.
Well, in that case, if there are no other questions, last chance. We'll leave it there then. Thanks again to all 4 of our speakers and to the contributions of everybody else. Thanks to everybody that's helped to organise this, and for all of you for coming. Really good session. So thanks so much for that, and we hope to see all of you again in future. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.